Feel the heavy, metallic pulse of a world driven by ambition, power, and the constant search for ultimate justice. We bring you the raw intensity of the human experience through a sharp, 3D cinematic lens of modern storytelling. Subscribe now and keep your finger on the pulse of the action.
My hands weren't as steady as they used to be. That's the first thing I noticed when I started carrying the envelope every month. The slight tremble when I'd seal it. Press it closed. Walk the 4 blocks to my sister-in-law's door, 63 years old, retired from 28 years driving a delivery truck for a building supply company in Mississauga, and my hands had started to betray me just slightly. But I kept going, every single month. Because my brother was gone, and that was the only thing I knew how to do. His name was Raymond. 3 years younger than me, which made him 59 when he died. We weren't the kind of brothers who called each other every Sunday or went to hockey games together the way people imagine brothers do. We were closer than that and more complicated than that at the same time. Raymond was the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands, engines, plumbing, a broken chair leg. He could take something falling apart and make it whole again. I always envied him that. Me, I just drove a truck and paid my bills on time and lived quietly in the house I'd bought in 1994 and never quite got around to selling after my wife passed. Raymond died in a boating accident on Georgian Bay. July 2 summers ago, he and 2 colleagues from the construction firm where he worked had gone out for a weekend fishing trip. The boat capsized in the storm that came up faster than the weather service predicted. One of the colleagues survived. The other man's body was recovered 3 days later. Raymond's body was never found. They called it a presumed drowning. His wife, I'll call her my sister-in-law throughout this, was notified. The paperwork took months. The death certificate, when it finally came, listed him as deceased. She got a small payout from his workplace insurance, not much. They hadn't been doing well financially even before the accident. Raymond had been between contracts, and they'd been living closer to the edge than he ever let on to me. When I found out the state of things after he was gone, I couldn't walk away. He was my brother, so every month, without being asked, I started leaving an envelope at her door. $2,000. I could afford it. The truck was paid off, the house was paid off, and my pension from the union was enough to live on modestly. I wasn't rich, but Raymond was my brother, and his wife had a daughter at home, 11 years old, shy and sweet, the kind of kid who left little crayon drawings on the fridge, and I wasn't going to let them fall apart. I never went inside. That was the strange part, though I didn't register it as strange for a long time. I'd knock. She'd open the door just slightly. She'd take the envelope. She'd say thank you, or sometimes just nod. And that would be it. The door would close again. I'd walk back to my truck and drive home. At first, I told myself it was grief. She was mourning. She needed space. Didn't want to be reminded of Raymond's family, maybe. I understood that. I gave her that space. I didn't push. I just kept bringing the envelope. 24 months. 2 years of this. $48,000 if you're keeping count. I was. It was my neighbor Gordon who finally said something. Gordon is 71, retired from the water treatment plant, a man who has lived next door to me for 16 years and never once involved himself in anything that wasn't his business. Which is exactly why I listened when he started to involve himself in mine. It was a Thursday evening in early March. I'd just gotten back from dropping off that month's envelope. I was pulling in my driveway when Gordon appeared at his fence with his coffee mug, which meant he'd been watching for me. "Can I ask you something?" he said. And it wasn't quite a question. I got out of the truck. "Go ahead. You're still going out there every month." "I am." He looked down at his mug. "To your sister-in-law's place." "Yes." Gordon has this way of pausing before he says things, like he's doing the calculation one more time to make sure he's right. He did that now. Then he said, "There's a man who parks on her street. Blue pickup. Ontario plates. He's there 3-4 nights a week. Has been for about 6 months." I didn't say anything right away. I thought about what that might mean. She was allowed to have a friend. She was allowed to have a life. She was in her mid-40s. She was a widow. There was nothing wrong with any of that. How do you know it's her place specifically? I asked. Because, Gordon said, I happened to be visiting my cousin on that street last fall, and I saw the truck. And then I saw the truck again when I went back in December. And I got curious, so last month I drove past on a Friday night. Truck was there again. I'm not saying anything for certain. I'm just saying, there's a man who is there very regularly, and you're the one bringing money every month, and I thought you should know. I thanked him. I went inside. I made myself dinner and I sat with it for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt in those first hours, because it matters for what came later. My first reaction wasn't suspicion toward her. My first reaction was a kind of tired sadness. She was lonely. Of course she was lonely. She'd lost a husband. If she'd found someone, that was life continuing. That was okay. The money wasn't a condition of her grieving in a particular way. I wasn't her father-in-law. I was just her husband's brother, doing what I could. But something Gordon said stayed with me. 3-4 nights a week. Has been for about 6 months. That wasn't a new relationship tentatively beginning. That was something established. Something settled. And if things were that settled, maybe she didn't need the same level of help anymore. Maybe things had shifted in a way I wasn't aware of, because she never let me pass the door. I decided I would simply ask her, not accusatorially, just honestly. The next month, when I brought the envelope, I would ask how she was doing, ask if she needed to talk about her situation, her finances, whether the support was still helpful, or whether things had changed. A conversation between adults. What I didn't plan on was going to her street for any other reason before that. But 11 days later, I did. I went because of something my daughter mentioned at Sunday dinner. My daughter lives in Brampton, and she keeps in better touch with Raymond's world than I do. She's 20 years younger than me, and grew up closer to his daughter in age. She mentioned, casually, that she'd heard through someone at work that my sister-in-law was looking at a property listing. A house in Owen Sound. Buying? I asked. Looking, my daughter said, but apparently serious looking. Owen Sound is 3 hours from Mississauga. It's a reasonable place to go if you're starting over somewhere quieter and cheaper. I had no objection to that. But it snagged in me, the way Gordon's information had snagged. She was thinking about moving. She hadn't mentioned this to me. In 2 years of monthly envelopes, she had never once initiated a conversation about the future. Not about her finances, not about her plans, not about anything. I drove past her street that Tuesday evening. I wasn't going to stop. I just wanted to. I don't know what I wanted. I drove past slowly, the way you do when you're working something out. The blue truck Gordon had mentioned was in the driveway, not parked on the street. In the driveway. Which meant he had access to the driveway. Which meant this was no longer a visitor situation. I parked around the corner. I sat there for probably 20 minutes. The light was on in the front window. There were 2 silhouettes moving behind the curtain. 2 people in the kitchen or the living room, moving around with the ease of people who are thoroughly comfortable in a space together. And then the front door opened. A man came out to get something from the truck. He left the front door open behind him. The light from the hallway spilled out onto the driveway, and I could see him clearly. I knew the way a person carries themselves before I could see his face. I'd grown up watching that particular way of moving through a space. Slightly forward-leaning, right shoulder rolling a little on each step. The way Raymond had walked since he was 20 years old from an old shoulder injury that never quite healed right. The shape of him. The height of him. The way he moved. My hands, which had been resting on the steering wheel, went completely still. He went back inside. The door closed. I sat in my truck for a very long time. I want to tell you I was certain immediately. But I wasn't. I was 63 years old, sitting in the dark, having what might have been the most significant moment of my life. And my first instinct was that I was wrong. That grief makes you see things, that any tall man with a shoulder roll would look like Raymond in the dark if you were already primed to be suspicious. I drove home. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called the one person I trusted with something this enormous, my friend Dennis, who I've known for 40 years and who spent the last 20 of his career as an insurance investigator before he retired. I didn't tell him what I thought I'd seen. I told him what I knew factually: the accident, the unrecovered body, the monthly payments, Gordon's observation, the truck in the driveway, the man I'd seen. Dennis listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You want to know if it's possible," he said. "I want to know if it's happened before." "Unrecovered bodies in Georgian Bay," Dennis said slowly. "A presumed drowning. A man who had financial stress before the incident. A surviving witness from the same company who could have confirmed a narrative." He paused. "It's not common, but it's not impossible. And it's been done." "If someone wanted to disappear," I said. "If someone wanted to disappear," Dennis agreed, "and they had help from the right person, and a storm that was convenient, yes, you could construct a scenario." "What would I need to know for certain?" "A photograph," Dennis said. "Something verifiable. Don't approach him. Don't confront anyone yet. Get a clear photograph and let me look at it." I spent 4 days on this. I'm not proud of the method, but I'm also not ashamed. I parked where I could see the driveway at times when the truck was likely to be there, based on the pattern Gordon had observed. On the third evening, the man came out in daylight. He walked to the truck, opened the side door, pulled out a toolbox. His face was turned away from me for most of it. But then he looked up. At the sky, at something across the street. And I had my phone up. I got 3 photographs. Not professional quality. But enough. I sent them to Dennis that night, and sat in my kitchen with a glass of water that I didn't drink and waited. Dennis called me at 7 the next morning. "That's Raymond," he said. He said it quietly, with a gentleness that told me he understood what those 2 words meant for me. Not just, "That's the man," or strong resemblance. He said it with the certainty of someone who had done this work for 20 years and wasn't going to be wrong about something this important. "You're sure?" I said. "There's a scar on his left forearm in the second photo," Dennis said. "You told me Raymond had a scar from a table saw when he was in his 30s. And the ear shape, I've looked at these against 2 photos you sent me of Raymond from Christmas 4 years ago. That's your brother." I put the phone down on the table and sat there for a long time. Here is what I eventually understood had happened, pieced together over the weeks that followed from what Dennis was able to determine and from the conversation I eventually had with Raymond himself. He had planned it for at least 8 months before the accident. The financial situation had been worse than I knew, not just tight but genuinely dire, with debts I wasn't aware of and a failed business venture from 3 years prior that had never been properly resolved. He and his colleague, the one who survived, had worked it out together. The colleague had agreed to corroborate the story. Raymond had used the storm as cover. He'd had a plan for where to go, how to live, a new name that existed in paperwork. Dennis eventually found traces of. And his wife had known. From the beginning, she had known she wasn't a widow. She was a co-conspirator who had agreed to let her husband disappear so they could eventually reunite somewhere new. Somewhere the debts couldn't follow. Somewhere no one knew them. The plan had been to wait 2 or 3 years, let the death certificate finalize, let the insurance pay out, and then follow him, quietly, without announcement, to Owen Sound or somewhere beyond it. The money I'd been bringing every month. I kept coming back to that. $48,000, delivered by hand, to a woman who knew her husband was alive and said nothing. She took the envelope every month and said thank you and closed the door. And Raymond knew. He knew I was coming. He knew what I was coming. He knew what I was doing. And neither of them said a word. I don't know when I've ever felt something as cold as that realization. Not angry, though the anger came later. First, there was just this enormous cold quiet in my chest, like the house after the heat shuts off in winter. Dennis asked me what I wanted to do. There were options. There were legal options, insurance fraud being significant among them. The payout from the workplace coverage alone was enough to make it a serious matter. There were ways to involve the right authorities and let the machinery have consequence to its work. Dennis laid them out for me professionally and without pressure, the way he used to when he was still doing this for a living. I told him I needed a week before I decided anything. What I did during that week was walk. I know that sounds simple, but I've always thought better on my feet, and there was a lot to think through. I walked the neighborhood. I walked along the lakeshore in the evenings. I thought about Raymond, not as the man in the driveway, but as the boy I'd grown up with, the one who'd taught himself guitar one winter from a library book. The one who'd shown up at the hospital the night my wife got her diagnosis and sat with me for 6 hours without being asked. I thought about what it must have felt like to be so buried under something that disappearing seemed like the only way out. I didn't excuse it, but I tried to understand the shape of it. And then I drove to her street one last time. I knocked. She opened the door. Same as always. Just slightly. The gap of someone who has been managing information for 2 years. She had the envelope reflex. Her hand came up slightly as if expecting it. I didn't have an envelope. "I need Raymond to come to the door," I said. She went very still. "I know he's here," I said. "I'm not recording this. I haven't called anyone yet. I'd like to talk to my brother." There was a long pause. Then the door opened wider, and Raymond was there. He looked older. He had a beard now, full and gray, which changed his face considerably, but standing in front of me, close, there was no ambiguity in the world. This was my brother. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you have been expecting them and dreading them at the same time for a very long time. "Come inside," he said. I shook my head. "Out here is fine." We stood on the front step. His wife was somewhere behind him. I could feel her presence in the doorway without seeing her. "How long have you known?" Raymond asked. "Does it matter?" He looked down at the step. I suppose not. I had prepared what I wanted to say, and now I said it. I told him that I understood desperation. I told him that I didn't understand and would never understand, allowing me to spend 2 years bringing money to a woman who knew the truth. I told him that the $48,000 was not something I was willing to simply let go, not because I couldn't afford to lose it, though the honest answer was that it wasn't nothing, but because the specific manner of the deception, the specific way they had both stood at that door month after month and taken what I offered and said nothing, was a thing I couldn't rationalize into acceptability. Raymond tried to speak twice. I let him get a few sentences out each time, and then I kept going. I told him that I had consulted someone familiar with insurance fraud. I told him that what had been done with the workplace payout constituted a serious matter that the right authorities would find very straightforward to prosecute. Between the surviving colleagues' cooperation, which Dennis believed was obtainable, and the paperwork trail that already existed, I told him I wasn't going to pursue that path. But I told him that the $48,000 was going to be returned to me. Not all at once. I wasn't unreasonable. But in regular payments, starting within 30 days until it was done, and if it wasn't done, my position on the other matter would change. Raymond looked at me for a long time. His wife appeared in the doorway. She looked like she was going to say something, and Raymond put his hand up slightly, and she didn't. "Okay," Raymond said. "Just that." "Okay," Raymond said. "Just that." "Okay." I nodded. I turned around and walked back to my truck. That was 4 months ago. The first payment came 26 days later, exactly as I'd said. It comes every month now. I don't know how they're managing it, and I've decided I don't need to know. They've begun the process of whatever comes next for them. They're not in Mississauga anymore, Dennis tells me, though he hasn't told me where, and I haven't asked. There is a small part of me that grieves Raymond all over again. I know that sounds strange. He's alive. He's out there somewhere, fixing things with his hands, living a life under a different name with a woman who chose to stay beside him through the worst possible version of a decision. In some ways that should be a relief. My brother is not at the bottom of Georgian Bay, but the brother I knew, The one who showed up at the hospital at midnight. The one who called me every time he fixed something and wanted to explain it whether I cared or not. That person made choices I cannot reconcile, and the relationship we had, which I thought was the kind that survives everything, turned out to be the thing he was willing to use, not with regret or apology before the fact. Just use. His daughter doesn't know. That's the part that stays with me most. She thinks her father drowned. She is now 13 years old, and she has been living with that loss, and her mother has let her live with it, and Raymond has let her live with it. And there is no version of this that gets better by telling her the truth right now. Maybe someday. That's not my decision to make. What I did was plant a garden. I know it doesn't follow from the rest of the story. But my backyard had been mostly dead grass for 15 years. I'd been meaning to do something with it since my wife passed and never did. Last spring, after all of this, I finally dug it up and put in a proper kitchen garden. Tomatoes, zucchini, 3 kinds of herbs, a row of bush beans along the back fence. Gordon helped me build a raised bed out of cedar planks. We worked on it for a weekend in April, and it felt like the most useful thing I'd done in years. I'm 63 years old. My knees give me trouble on the stairs. I pay my bills on time. I live quietly in the house I've had for 30 years, and I eat tomatoes in the summer that I grew myself, which is a small thing, but it is entirely mine. I did what I did for my brother because I loved him. That part remains true even now. I also know exactly what he did with that love, and I know what I did with the knowledge of it. I chose not to destroy him. I chose to be paid back instead. Some people will say that was too lenient. Some people will say that was too lenient. Some people will say I let him off easy. I say I got my money back and I got my dignity back, and I didn't spend the next 5 years of my life in courtrooms and newspapers. I say I have tomatoes ripening on the vine right now, and next month another payment will come, and Raymond is somewhere out there alive, and I don't have to wonder anymore. That's enough. For me, right now, that's enough. For me, right now, that's enough. There's something I've come to understand slowly. The way you understand things that arrive through pain rather than instruction. The way we treat people when no one is watching is the truest record of who we are. Not the grand gestures. Not the moments we're conscious of being observed, the quiet ones. The envelopes left at a door that never fully opens. The choice to keep going when nothing is given in return. For 2 years, I made that choice. And for 2 years, the people I was making it for were counting on my decency to work against me. They understood, perhaps better than I did at the time, that a man who acts from genuine love is a man who can be used. That's a hard thing to sit with. But sitting with hard things is, I've found, how you eventually get clear about them. What happened to me wasn't just a betrayal by a brother. It was a lesson about the difference between loyalty and blindness. I was loyal. I don't regret that. Loyalty to the people we love is one of the few things worth carrying into old age, but I had confused loyalty with the suspension of my own judgment. I had decided somewhere along the way that asking questions was a form of disrespect toward grief. That turning away from red flags was the same thing as being kind. It wasn't. It was just convenient for the people who needed me not to look too closely. The consequence of that confusion cost me $48,000 and 2 years of my life. That's the arithmetic of it, but the deeper cost was something harder to name. The specific grief of discovering that someone you believed in had been making calculations about you the entire time, not in a moment of weakness, deliberately, over months and years. And yet, when I stood on that front step and said what needed to be said, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Clarity. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Just the clean, quiet certainty that comes from finally seeing a thing whole and responding to it honestly. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten beyond what was true. I stated what had happened, what I knew, and what I required. That was the intelligence of it, if there was any. Knowing the difference between what I was owed and what I actually wanted, which were not the same thing. What I wanted was not to see my brother in a courtroom. What I wanted was not to spend the next chapter of my life in the machinery of legal consequence. What I wanted, underneath all of it, was to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know I had handled the worst thing that had ever happened to me without becoming worse myself. I think about the garden when I think about all of this now. I planted it because I needed something to tend that would grow honestly. No hidden arrangements, no withheld information, just soil and water and time doing what they do. There's a kind of wisdom in that, I think. You put in the work, you wait. The thing either grows or it doesn't, and either way you know exactly why. I'm 63 years old. I've been deceived by someone I would have trusted with anything. I got my money back. I kept my dignity. I kept my garden. Some days that feels like enough, and some days it feels like the only thing that matters. Raymond is out there somewhere, living under a name that isn't his. I hope he finds something worth growing too. Not for his sake, for his daughter's. She deserves a father who eventually becomes someone she doesn't have to be ashamed of. That's between him and whatever he's willing to face when he finally stops running. As for me, I have tomatoes on the vine, a neighbor who helped me build something useful, and the particular piece of a man who chose not to become what was done to him. That's the whole of it. That's what I've got.